From George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's All and Everything, Chapter 41. The Bokharian Dervish Hadji-Asvatz-Troov. As my first meeting with this contemporary terrestrial three-brained being, with whom I saw the said experiments, and thanks to whom, in all probability, information about the fundamental, sacred cosmic law of Heptapara Parshinok will again be established there and become accessible to everyone, even from among the ordinary contemporary beings with a thirst for knowledge, may turn out to be extremely interesting and instructive to you. I shall therefore tell you all about this meeting also, in all possible detail. This first meeting of mine with him took place 3 terrestrial years before my final departure from that solar system. Once, while traveling over the continent Asia, in that part of it called Bokhara, I chanced to meet and get on friendly terms with a certain three-brained being belonging to the group inhabiting that part of the surface of your planet, who was by profession what they call there a dervish, and whose name was Hadji-Asvatz-Troov. He was very typical of those contemporary terrestrial three-brained beings who have a tendency to enthuse over, as is said there, higher matters, and who always automatize themselves to speak about them without any essential cognition with anyone they meet, on opportune and inopportune occasions. And whenever we met, he also liked to talk only about these matters. One day, we started talking about what is called there the ancient Chinese science named Sha-Chai Mernis. This science is nothing but fragments of the above-mentioned totality of true information concerning the sacred Heptapara Parshinok, cognized by the great Chinese twin brothers and by other genuine ancient scientists, and then called by them the totality of true information about the law of ninefoldness. I have already told you that certain fragments of this knowledge remained intact and passed from generation to generation through a very limited number of initiated beings there. I must here say that if these fragments, which have by chance remained intact, and which have passed and are still passing there from generation to generation through this very limited number of initiated beings, do not fall into the hands of contemporary scientists there, then this will be a great stroke of luck for the future three-brained beings of your planet. And it will be a great stroke of luck because if these surviving fragments of genuine knowledge were to fall into the hands of the contemporary scientists there, then, thanks to their inherency of wiseacring, they would without fail cook up all kinds of their scientific porridge about the sense put into these fragments, and thereby the, without this, scarcely smoldering reason of all the other three-brained beings would be entirely extinguished. And besides, these last remnants of the former great attainments of their ancestors would thereby be also completely wiped off the face of this ill-fated planet. And so, my boy, once, when I was talking with this dervish Hadji-Asvatz-Troov about the ancient Chinese science, Sha-Chai Mernis, he, in the course of conversation, proposed that I should go with him to another dervish, a friend of his, a great authority on this ancient Chinese science, to talk about it with him. He told me that his friend resided in Upper Bokhara, far away from everyone, and was there occupied with certain experiments concerning that same science. Having no special business in that town, where we then happened to be, and as his friend resided just among these mountains, the nature of which I had long intended to see, I at once agreed, and on the very next day we set off. From that town where we were, we walked 3 days. Finally, high up in the mountains of Upper Bokhara, we stopped at a small gorge. This part of Bokhara is called Upper because it is very mountainous and much higher than that part of Bokhara which, to distinguish it, is called Lower Bokhara. At the said gorge, my acquaintance, the dervish Hadji-Asvatz-Troov, asked me to help him move a small stone slab to one side, and when we had moved it, a small aperture was revealed underneath it, from the edges of which 2 iron bars projected. He put these bars together and began to listen. Soon a strange sound was heard coming from them, and to my astonishment, Hadji-Asvatz-Troov said something into that aperture in a language unknown to me. After he had finished speaking, we moved the stone slab back to its old place and went on. After having gone a considerable distance, we stopped in front of a rock, and Hadji-Asvatz-Troov began to wait very tensely for something, when suddenly the enormous stone which lay there opened and formed an entrance into a kind of cave. We entered this cave and began moving forward, when I noticed that our way was lit up alternately by what are called gas and electricity. Although this lighting astonished me and several questions about it arose in me, I nevertheless decided not to disturb the serious attentiveness of my fellow traveler. When we had again walked a considerable distance further, we saw at one of the turnings, coming to meet us, another terrestrial 3-brained being, who met us with the greetings customary there on such occasions, and led us further. He, as it appeared, was the friend of my first Dervish acquaintance. He was already, according to terrestrial understanding, quite elderly, and being tall in comparison with those living round about, seemed extraordinarily thin. His name was Hadji-Asvatz-Troov. While talking with us, he led us to a small section of the cave, where we all sat down on the felt that covered the floor there, and while conversing, began to eat what is called cold Bokharian shilaplav, out of earthen vessels which this elderly being brought to us from a neighboring section. While we were eating, my first Dervish acquaintance told him, by the way, that I was also very interested in the science Chai-Mernis, and explained briefly which questions were already well known to me, and what in general we had talked about before. After that, the Dervish Hadji-Asvatz-Troov began to question me himself, and I gave him corresponding answers, but of course in that form already habitual to me, by which I could always hide my real nature. There on your planet, I became in general so skillful in talking in this manner that your favorites always took me for one of their brother scientists. From subsequent conversation with him, I understood that this respected Hadji-Asvatz-Troov had already been long interested in the said knowledge, and that during the last 10 years he had been studying it exclusively only practically. I also understood that from this studying he had attained results such as it is no longer proper to terrestrial 3-brained beings to attain. When I had made all this clear to myself, I was much astonished and became very interested to know how this had come about, because I already very well knew that this knowledge had already long before ceased to exist in the reason of the 3-brained beings of the earth, and that this venerable Hadji could scarcely have heard of it often, and thus have had an interest, as happens among them, gradually formed in him. And indeed, my boy, it has already long ago become proper there to the 3-brained beings who have taken your fancy to become interested only in what they often see or often hear about, and whenever they do become interested in something, then this interest of theirs stifles all other being necessities in them, and it will always seem obvious to them that what interests them at the given moment is just the very thing that makes the world go round. When the relations necessary in such a situation had been established between this sympathetic dervish, Hadji-Asvatz-Troov, and myself, that is to say, when he had already begun to talk with me, more or less normally, without the, so to say, mask, which it has already become fully proper to contemporary beings to wear in their relations with other beings like themselves, especially when they meet these others for the first time, then, when these necessary relations had been established between us, I asked him, of course in the corresponding approved manner, why and how he had become interested in this branch of true knowledge. Here you might as well know that in general, there on the surface of your planet, on each separate part, during the process of the ordinary being existence of these strange, three-brained beings, their own special forms of external relationship with each other have gradually been formed and have passed from generation to generation. And these various forms of mutual relationship among them were formed of themselves after the being property of sensing the inner feeling of similar beings in relation to oneself had become quite atrophied in their psyche, which property must infallibly exist in all beings of our great universe without distinction of form or place of arising. At the present time among them, good or bad mutual relationships are established exclusively only according to outer calculated manifestations, chiefly according to what they call amiability, that is, by empty words in which there is not a single atom of what is called the result of an inner benevolent impulse, such as arises in general in the presences of all beings in direct contact with those similar to themselves. There, at present, however, one being may inwardly wish another well, yet if for some reason or other this well-wishing being were in some way to express himself to another in words conventionally regarded as not good, then all is over. In all the different spiritualized localizations of the latter, data are invariably crystallized, which always by association engender in his common presence the conviction that the former, who, as a matter of fact, inwardly wished him very well, only exists to do him always and everywhere every kind of what they call vileness. It has become very important there, particularly during recent times, to know every kind of form of verbal address in order to have friends and not to make oneself enemies. The abnormal existence of these strange three-brained beings has not only spoiled their own psyche, but this abnormal existence of theirs has by repercussion gradually also spoiled the psyche of almost all the other one-brained and two-brained terrestrial beings. Data for engendering the aforesaid inner being impulse are not yet formed either in the presences of any of those terrestrial one-brained or two-brained beings with whom these strange three-brained beings who have taken your fancy have long had and still have frequent contact and relations. Although these being data are still formed in the presences of certain terrestrial one-brained and two-brained beings of other exterior forms, as for example those named by them tigers, lions, bears, hyenas, snakes, phalanges, scorpions, and so on, who have not had and do not now have in their mode of existence any contact or relation with these biped favorites of yours, nevertheless there is already formed in their common presences, thanks of course to the abnormally established conditions of the ordinary existence of your favorites, one very strange and highly interesting particularity, namely, that the enumerated beings, tigers, lions, bears, hyenas, snakes, phalanges, scorpions, and so on, perceive the inner feeling of fear in other beings before them as enmity towards themselves, and therefore strive to destroy these others in order to avert the menace from themselves. And this so happened because your favorites, thanks always to the same abnormal conditions of existence, have gradually become, as they themselves say, cowardly from head to foot, and because at the same time the need of destroying the existence of others has been inculcated in them, also from head to foot. And so, when they, being already cowards of the highest degree, are about to destroy the existence of the beings of these other forms, or when they chance to meet such beings, who it must be said, to their misfortune and to our regret, have become at the present time already much stronger than they, physically as well as in other being attainments, then they become afraid, as they say there in such case, to the point of wetness. At the same time, thanks to the inherent need in their presences to destroy the existence of other beings breeding on their planet, they, at such moments, contrive with their whole being how to destroy the existence of these beings of other forms. And as a result of all this, from the radiations issuing from these favorites of yours, inherent in their peculiar presences, there are gradually formed in the common presences of these other beings, of the aforementioned forms, side by side with the data which should exist in them for engendering the aforementioned impulse of instinctively showing respect and sympathy to every form of being, other data with a special functioning, thanks to which the feeling of cowardice appearing in the common presences of other beings, chiefly in the presences of your favorites, is perceived as a menace to themselves. That is why, whenever these other mentioned one-brained and two-brained terrestrial beings meet with your favorites, they, wishing to escape the danger to their own existence, always strive to destroy the existence of these favorites of yours. There on your planet also, all beings in the beginning, in spite of difference of exterior form and brain system, existed together in peace and concord. And even now, occasionally, one of these favorites of yours perfects himself firstly to the degree of sensing with all his spiritualized parts that every being, or, as is said, every breathing creature, is equally near and dear to our common Father Creator. And secondly, thanks to having actualized in himself being part dog duty, he attains the complete destruction in his presence of the data for engendering the impulse of cowardice before beings of other forms, in consequence of which these beings of other forms not only do not attempt to destroy the existence of this perfected being from among your contemporary favorites, but even show him every kind of respect and service as to a being with greater objective possibilities. In short, all this and a multitude of other small factors, also ensuing from the abnormal existence of these favorites of yours, have finally brought about the formation among them, for mutual relationship, of various forms of, as they express it, verbal amenity. And as I have already told you, each locality there has its own special form. The attitude taken towards me by this sympathetic terrestrial three-brained being, Hadji-Asvatz-Troov, was benevolent chiefly because I was the friend of a good friend of his. It must here be remarked, by the way, that the three-brained beings of this part of the surface of your planet are the only ones among whom the relationship of true friendship still exists. Among them, as it is general everywhere among three-brained beings, and just as it was in the first epochs on that planet also, not only is a friend himself a friend, but his near relatives and his friends are also regarded as friends and are treated just the same as the friend himself. Because I then passed for the friend of the Dervish Hadji-Asvatz-Troov, who was a very good friend of this Hadji-Asvatz-Troov, he then at once treated me in a very friendly manner. I wished to make the relationship still better, as I very much wanted to know how he had become interested in this knowledge, and how he had attained to such scientific accomplishments as were unsurpassed on the earth. And therefore, throughout our conversation, I liberally used those forms of verbal amenity which were customary in that locality. When during our conversation, which dealt exclusively with the knowledge now called there Shat Chai Mernis, we came to speak of the nature and the significance of vibrations in general, and when we happened to talk about the octave of sound, Hadji-Asvatz-Troov then said that not only had the octave of sound 7 aspects of relatively independent whole manifestations, but that the vibrations of any one of these relatively independent manifestations follow, in their arising as well as in their manifestation, the same conformity to law. Continuing to speak further about the laws of vibrations of sound, he said, I myself became interested in the knowledge Shat Chai Mernis through the laws of vibrations of sound, and they were the cause of my devoting the whole of my life subsequently to this knowledge. And after thinking a little to himself, he related as follows. I must first tell you, my friends, that although I was a very rich man before I entered the brotherhood of the Dervishes, yet I was very fond of working at a certain craft. Namely, I used to make various stringed musical instruments of the kind called sayaz, tar, kemancha, zimbal, and so on. And even after I had entered the brotherhood, I devoted all my free time to this profession of making musical instruments, chiefly for our dervishes. And the cause of my further serious interest in the laws of vibrations was the following. Once the sheikh of our monastery called me to him and said, Haji, in the monastery while I was still an ordinary dervish, whenever during certain mysteries our musician dervishes played the melodies of the sacred canticles, all of us dervishes always experienced from these melodies of the sacred canticles particular sensations corresponding to the text of the given sacred canticle. But here, during my long and careful observations, I have never yet noticed any particular effect on our brother dervishes from these same sacred canticles. What is wrong? What is the cause of this? To find out the cause has recently been my aim, and I have now called you to speak with you about it. And perhaps you, as an amateur specialist at making musical instruments, can help me to clear up this question which interests me. Thereupon we began to inquire into this question from every aspect. After long deliberations, we finally decided that probably the whole cause lay in the nature itself of the vibrations of the sounds. And we came to this conclusion because from our conversation it further became clear that in the monastery in which our sheikh had been an ordinary dervish, they played, besides the tambour, stringed musical instruments, while here in our monastery they played these same sacred melodies exclusively on wind instruments. We further decided to replace immediately all the wind instruments of our monastery by stringed instruments. But then another very serious question arose for us, namely, that it would be impossible to get together from among our dervishes the necessary number of specialists for playing the stringed instruments. Then our sheikh, having thought a little, said to me, Haji, you as a specialist in stringed instruments, try. Perhaps you can manage to make a stringed musical instrument on which any dervish, without being a specialist, can produce the sounds of the necessary melody, merely by a mechanical action, such as, for example, turning, striking, pressing, and so on. This proposal of our sheikh then immediately greatly interested me, and I undertook the task with great pleasure. After this decision, I got up and, having received his blessing, went home. Having returned home, I sat down and thought very seriously for a long time, and the result of all my thinking was that I decided to make an ordinary zimbal, and to devise, with the help of my friend the dervish Hadji-Asvatz-Troov, such a mechanism of little hammers that their striking should produce the corresponding sounds. And that same evening I went to this friend of mine, the dervish Hadji-Asvatz-Troov. Although this dervish friend of mine was regarded by his comrades and acquaintances as rather a queer sort, nevertheless they all respected and esteemed him, as he was very sensible, and learned, and often talked of such questions that everyone, willy-nilly, had to ponder about them seriously. Before his initiation into the dervishes, he had been a real professional, namely a watchmaker. And in the monastery also he devoted all his free time to this favorite craft of his. My friend this dervish, Hadji-Asvatz-Troov, had, by the way, recently become much enthused over a certain freakish idea, namely, he was trying to make a mechanical watch which would show the time very exactly without the aid of any spring whatsoever. This freakish idea of his he explained in the following brief and very simple formulation. Nothing on the earth is absolutely still, because the earth itself moves. On the earth, only gravity is still, and then only in half the space occupied by its volume. I wish to get such an absolute equilibrium of levers that their movement, which must necessarily proceed from the tempo of the movement of the earth, should exactly correspond to the required movement of the hands of a clock, and so on and so forth. When I came to this queer friend of mine and explained to him what I wanted to obtain and what help I expected of him, he also immediately became very much interested in this and promised to help me in every way possible. And the very next day we started work together. From this joint work, the skeleton of this mechanical musical instrument devised by me was soon ready. I myself marked and spaced the places for the corresponding strings, while my queer friend continued to work on the mechanism of the little hammers. And then, when I had finished stretching the strings and had begun to tune them correspondingly, just then that began which aroused that further interest in me, which brought me to the experiments concerning the laws of vibrations, which I began and am still continuing. It began in this way. I must first tell you that before this I already very well knew that half the length of any string gives twice the number of vibrations of a whole string of equal volume and density. And in accordance with this principle, I arranged on the zimbal what are called bridges for the strings, and then began correspondingly to tune all the strings for a certain ancient sacred melody in 1/8 toned sounds, of course according to my Parambarsasadan, or as it is called in Europe, tuning fork, producing the vibrations of the Chinese absolute note do. It was during this tuning that I first clearly constated that the principle, namely, that the number of the vibrations of a string is inversely proportional to its length, does not always, but only sometimes coincide with the obtaining of what is called a common blending harmonic consonance. And this constatation so greatly interested me that I then gave all my attention to the investigation of this alone, and entirely ceased to occupy myself with the said zimbal. Then it so chanced to happen that my queer friend also became very much interested in the same thing, and together we began to investigate this fact which had so astonished us both. Only after several days did my friend and I notice that we were neglecting our main work, and therefore we decided from that day to devote half our time to finishing the zimbal and the other half to the said investigations. And indeed, we very soon managed to carry out both of these tasks of ours in such a way that one should not hinder the other. Soon the mechanical zimbal devised by us was ready. It was entirely satisfactory to us, and I must say turned out to be something of the kind of the new Greek hand organ, but with quarter-tone sounds, and a little larger in size. It was set in action by turning, by which the little hammers struck the corresponding strings, and this correspondence was obtained by means of bundles of flattened reeds, in which we made dents, into which, during the turning, the ends of the little hammers fell and set the corresponding strings vibrating. For each separate sacred melody, we prepared a separate bundle of these flattened reeds fastened together, and they could be changed at will according to the melody required. When we finally handed over our original zimbal to our sheikh and told him what interested us most of all at that moment, he not only gave us his blessing to leave the monastery for a while for our purpose to occupy ourselves with the question which interested us, but even put at our disposal a large sum of money from the resources accumulated in the monastery. We then moved here and began to live far from other people and outside of our brotherhood. This friend of mine and I lived here all the time in complete peace and concord, and only recently did I lose forever this never-to-be-forgotten and irreplaceable friend of mine. And I lost him in the following lamentable circumstances. Several weeks ago, he went down to the banks of the river Amu-Darya to the town X for various materials and instruments. As he was leaving the town to return here, a stray bullet from the firing taking place between the Russians and the Anglo-Afghans struck him down on the spot, and I was immediately informed of this calamity by our mutual acquaintance, Asart, who chanced to be passing there. Several days afterwards, I brought his remains here and buried him over there. He added, pointing to a corner of the cave where a peculiar form of projection could be seen. Having said this, Hadji-Asvatz-Troov stood up and, making a gesture of prayer, evidently for the repose of the soul of his friend, motioned with his head for us to follow him. We went and found ourselves again in the chief passage of the cave, where this venerable terrestrial being stopped in front of a projection and pressed something, whereupon the block moved apart, and behind it an entrance was formed into another section of the cave. This section, which we came upon this time, was, in addition to its formation by nature herself, also artificially constructed so originally, according to the reason of your contemporary favorites, that I wish to describe its construction to you as detailedly as possible. The walls of this section, the ceiling, and even the floor were lined with several layers of very thick felt. As it was afterwards explained to me, this accidentally natural formation was utilized and adapted so that there should not penetrate there, from the other sections, or from the outside in general, the slightest vibration from any manifestations whatsoever, either from any movement, rustling, shuffling, or even from vibrations produced by the breathing, anywhere nearby, of various large or small creatures. In this unusual interior were several experimental apparatuses of strange form, and among them was a specimen of the sound-producing instrument which I brought with me from the surface of your planet, the type of contemporary terrestrial sound-producing instrument which your favorites call a grand piano. The cover of this grand piano was open, and to each series of the strings visible beneath it were fitted independent little apparatuses, which served as measures of the degree of vivifyingness of the variously sourced vibrations, and were called vibrometers. When I saw the large number of these vibrometers, the being impulse of astonishment in my common presence increased to such an intensity as that which our Mullah Nasr ad-Din expresses by the following words: "The limit of full satiety is bursting." This impulse of astonishment had arisen and progressively increased in me from the moment when I saw, in the passages of the cave, the gas and electric lighting. I had already then wondered whence and how all this was present here. I already well knew before this that although these strange three-brained beings there have again learned to utilize such sources from cosmic formations for their, as they say, lighting, yet these means for this lighting of theirs are obtained by them with the aid of very complicated adaptations, and these adaptations are accessible only where there is a large group of them. And suddenly, here was this lighting, so far from any such group, and particularly in the absence around the place of any signs by which, among contemporary beings, such possibilities are in general accompanied. And when I saw the aforementioned vibrometer for measuring the degree of the vivifyingness of vibrations, the impulse of astonishment in me, as I have already said, increased to the highest degree. I was yet the more astonished because concerning this I also already knew very well that at that period there, nowhere did there exist such apparatuses by means of which it is possible to count any vibrations whatever, and therefore I again wondered, from where could this venerable old man, dwelling in these wild mountains, so far from the beings composing contemporary civilization, have obtained such apparatuses? Notwithstanding this interest of mine, I did not venture to ask the venerable Hadji-Asvatz-Troov for an explanation just then. I did not venture to ask him because it was to be feared that such a digressive question might change the course of the conversation which had begun, and from which I expected the elucidation of the chief question which interested me. In this section of the cave were many other apparatuses as yet unknown to me, among which stood one very strange apparatus to which were attached several what are called masks, from which something like pipes, made of the throats of cows, went somewhere up to the ceiling of the cave. Through these pipes, as I also afterwards learned, the air necessary for the breathing of the beings present during the experiments could flow in from outside, because this interior was then closed hermetically on all sides. The beings who were present during the experiments wore over their faces these masks which were on this strange apparatus. When we were all seated on the floor in the said section of the cave, the venerable Hadji-Asvatz-Troov said, among other things, that during the period of his investigations, he and his friend, the Dervish Aziz-Nuran, had also occasion to study very thoroughly all the theories existing on the earth about vibrations made at any time by serious terrestrial scientists. He said, "We studied the Syrian theory of the great Maimonides, and the Arabian theory of the famous Hadji-Asvatz-Troov, and the Greek of the philosopher Pythagoras, and of course all the Chinese theories. And we made apparatuses exactly similar to those with which all these ancient sages made their experiments, and we even made an addition to one of their apparatuses, which is now the chief one for my experiments. With this apparatus, Pythagoras made his experiments, and it was then called a monochord. But now that I have altered it, I call it a vibrotio." Having said this, he pressed something on the floor with one hand, and with the other he pointed to a very strangely shaped apparatus standing there, and added that it was the same altered monochord. The apparatus he pointed to consisted of a 2-meter board, the whole front half of which was divided into sections called frets, like the neck of the sound-producing instrument called guitar, and on it was stretched only one string. To the other half of this board were fastened a great number of vibrometers, like those on the strings of the grand piano, and they were affixed in such a way that their indicating needles came just over the mentioned frets on the front side of the board. To the back half of this board was fastened a whole network of various small glass and metal pipes, which also served to produce sounds, but this time sounds obtained from vibrations arising from certain movements and currents of ordinary or of artificially compressed or rarefied air. And for measuring the vibrations of these sounds, the same vibrometers served as were used for measuring the vibrations arising from the string. The venerable Hadji-Asvatz-Troov was about to say something, but just then, from another section of the cave, a small boy of the type called Uzbek entered, carrying on a tray a tea service and some green tea.